Alright everybody, welcome back. So this is video 2 in our series of how to get up and started with Bambu Studio and Bambu Lab printers. So in the last video we covered some basic controls in the Bambu Studio, and we also covered how to get slicing, importing models, and how to send the file to the printer. In this video we're going to go over a few more of these button options up here on the top row, as well as some support settings. Two very common things that you're going to need to advance your level of 3D printing. So first things first, let's talk about multiple build plates and multiple objects on a build plate in Bambu Studio. You can see right now I have this build plate with the benchy on it. And what if I needed to have more space? Maybe I want to plan a couple of different projects out, or maybe I have a very large project with more files that can fit on a plate, but I don't want to keep remembering what did I load, what did I not load. There's a trick to that. Up in this top row, right next to the Add button, is what's known as Add Plate button. So if we click on that, it does exactly what it says, Add Plate. So now, if you filled up one plate and you still need room for all your other parts, you can actually go ahead and put them over here. Now you can do so by clicking on the object and using the move command, which is up here. You can actually click and drag this little handle. So I'll zoom in here a little bit more. You can grab the little handles in any direction. There's a green one for on the y-axis, and there's a blue one for the z-axis, even though it will snap to the bed. Now there's also another way you can move this. You can specify an exact coordinate. So say, for instance, you wanted to put this one back on the other plate, and that would be an x-axis 120, and it moves it over to the plate. There's also a third option. If you deselect the move command, and you haven't anything selected, you can click and hold on the object and simply move it wherever you want in space. So if you want to freeform this, you can do so. If you want to use the move command and be very accurate, or only move in one axis at a time, you can do that as well. Now, why would you need to do this? Well, like I said, if you have a lot of one object and they're just not going to fit here, or if you want to have two separate objects and you don't want to print them both on the same plate. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to show you real quick a little tip. This is tip number 1 for the video. If you right-click on the object, you get a context menu. There's a whole lot of things that we'll go over here at a future video. But the first one is, you can fill bed with copies, or you can clone a model. Cloning will do exactly that. It'll ask how many times do you want to clone it. In this instance, maybe I want to clone it 5 times. Now it popped up a bunch of benchies. Say that 5 times fast. Now what happens if I don't want to have to sit here and drag each one of these benchies and put it where I want it? Well, there's 2 ways you can do this. One is the Arrange All command, and one is the Arrange Plate command. So if you come up here, there's this little button that says Arrange All Objects. It'll ask for a few options. The default is 0 spacing and allow multi-materials on the same plate. You can also allow it to rotate for arrangement. If you don't really have a particular way that that part needs to be printed on the build plate, I like to keep this checked just so it helps try to fit it on there a little better if it's kind of a big one. So then you click Arrange, and you can see it deleted the other plate because it knew I don't need it. And you can see it rotated the benchies to try and nest them as best as possible here. None of them are touching, and it looks good. So let's go ahead and hit the delete button and delete a couple of these benchies. Now I'm going to clone it again. I'm going to give it 5 clones. But watch what happens if I uncheck Auto Rotate for arrangement. It keeps them all facing the same direction. Now let's say I wanted that other build plate. I wanted these benchies over here and these benchies over here. If I click Arrange All, it's going to try and shove everything onto as minimal plates or however many plates it thinks it needs. If I simply go over here and look at the very similar button next to the plate, this is the Arrange Plate icon. It will only mess with what's on that plate itself and leave the other plate alone. Now, again, if you wanted to select and lock a specific plate to not being moved, you can click the little lock icon. It's now locked, and pressing the Arrange All Objects button will actually only arrange the one on the non-locked plate. So, let's go ahead and get rid of that plate. I don't need it. So that's a little tip on how to clone objects if you need to make multiples. So say you did a whole bunch of settings and rotations and you want to make an exact duplicate. That's the way to do it. Maybe you're interested in filling the entire bed with as many as you possibly can. It's going to go ahead and do that. And it's also going to try and auto-arrange them for you. So now, let's undo that. Let's auto-rotate and fill bed with copies and watch what happens. It can actually probably pack a few more on there. It's going to look a little more chaotic, but you can see we've got more benchies on there. Now, do I recommend printing this many benchies on a plate? Maybe not. There's some here on the edge that may not hold down quite well. But you can sure try. Alright, so we've talked a little bit about cloning objects, arranging objects, and multiple build plates. So now let's talk about scaling objects. How do you make them bigger or smaller? Really simple. You can go over here to this little scale button, click on it, and it gives you a couple of options in the drop down, and you'll notice there's some handles that popped up on the benchy. Just like the other tools, there's multiple ways to get the object to do what you want it to do. If you grab these blue handles, it'll scale the object in all dimensions equally. If you grab the red ones, it'll only scale it in one axis. Similarly for the green one, and similarly for the blue one. If ever you want to go back to default, remember, our friend, the little orange circle up here, click on that, and it sets it back to default. You can also type in a number here in these boxes, say 200%, and it'll scale it 200%. You can also give it an exact dimension on X, Y, or Z. So if I wanted a 100 millimeter tall benchy, it will make sure that it's at least 100 millimeters tall. Now, if you don't want it to be the exact size in every dimension, you can simply uncheck Uniform Scale right here. And now maybe I want a really, really long benchy. Maybe I want it to be 230 millimeters long, kind of a tanker benchy. I can do that, but as you can see, it didn't change the y-axis or the z-axis. So that's scaling in a nutshell. There are things to consider when it comes to scaling, such as when you go up into a larger size. Oh, I forgot to turn Uniform Scale on. If you go up to a larger size benchy, obviously everything is scaled, including things like overhangs, text sizes, and obviously the footprint on the bed, which can lead to more warping if it's a larger, flatter part. Similarly, if you scale down quite a bit, say 25%, it's going to get really, really hard for the nozzle to print that benchy. It's very tiny, and it may not stick to the bed very well. Let's take a look at what that looks like. It'll only be a 9-minute benchy. However, you can see there's pieces and parts that it simply cannot print because it's too small for the nozzle diameter. It's sure going to try, but it doesn't know quite well how it's going to turn out. There is a warning down here that says it can't be printed because there's empty layers here, so at least you get some kind of a warning that tells you maybe consider changing your print. Again, let's go ahead and scale this one up, say 300%. Let's zoom out, slice the plate, and you can see the 3D Benchy has larger overhangs now. So it's something you could consider when you start scaling objects. What will you need? Maybe you need some supports. Maybe need a smaller nozzle. Now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about rotating and placing objects on a flat face for best printing. As you can see in the Preview tab, and if you scroll all the way down, you can see that the Benchy starts from the ground up on a nice flat surface and builds from there. Now what happens if we use this rotate command up here and decide we want to grab one of these axes and rotate the Benchy? Well, there's a couple ways you can look at this. If you grab the axis, you can see these little tick marks, and they kind of snap to it in 5-degree increments. If you move your mouse further up, it's a little more freeform without snapping. So let's go ahead and just make sure the Benchy's pointing up. Maybe it's going to see some rough seas today. We'll go ahead and slice the plate, and boom. You can see not much is contacting the bed down here. In fact, quite a bit is up in the air. And scrolling down, you can see that there's not much contact area down here. And this could be a problem for our little Benchy friend. One of the big things is, with a small contact area at high speeds, it may vibrate and come loose. The other thing you're looking at here is you can see underneath here all this blue lines, which indicates an overhang wall. What that means is there's nothing beneath this to support it, and it could end up drooping, or it could end up failing. And that's because gravity acts on 3D prints just like anything else. Another interesting thing to note is right here you can see this little kind of staggered piece. There's nothing there. And scrolling up, you can see it's going to try and print this in midair. And if you've ever thrown spaghetti at a wall to see if it'll stick, you'll know that it's going to fall down and not print very well. So in that kind of an instance, you may need some support material. What is support material? I'm glad you asked. Let's jump into that next. So let's take a look at support settings. Over in this little tab here, you can see that there's a lot of different options for support settings if you're under advanced mode. Under regular mode, there's not so many. Simply ticking the box for enabling support will allow support to be printed on your print. The default is normal auto, and it's going to try and put it wherever it thinks it needs, based on overhangs. So let's take a look. Wow, all that green stuff sure is interesting. So you can see it definitely supported the area that needed it, but it's going to support everything that has an overhang. And you can change how much it supports by changing this threshold angle. So if you figure that straight up and down is 90, and this is about 30, that's generally about where it's going to start supporting. Closer you get to 90, it's not going to support it. As you can see, it didn't support the very, very front of this Benchy. Now, I don't think that these overhangs up here are going to need any support, and probably not this bow section on the back. Really, you're probably only going to need support right underneath the Benchy to make this print. How do we fix that? Well, that's where we get into manual support painting. So let's go back to the Prepare tab. Let's change these support types from normal auto to normal manual. Now what you have to do is there's a little button up here on the bar that says Supports Painting. If you click on it, you can come back here and you can kind of look at where you think supports may be needed, or you select Highlight Overhang Areas. And as you drag this closer, you can see that some areas have lit up red. What this is doing is it's highlighting that angle that you see here. So if we set this to 30, like in the normal support settings, you can see why it placed support where it did, because these are a 30-degree overhang. Now they're kind of a short distance, so they'll probably print fine. But what if we want to just print it here on the bottom? We can simply change this icon to a sphere, and we can start painting on, You can change the pen size to paint on more. However, if you go outside the area, whoops, it's going to paint support there as well. Now you can hit the undo button up here, or you can hit erase all painting. What I like to do is have this little box checked called on overhangs only. So as I'm painting over here, if I slip my mouse, it's not going to print or paint where I don't want. Now this is useful for smaller areas or details, or if you only want to maybe support half this area. If you want to get through this faster, fill is definitely a better option. So when you hover over it, it'll say, do you want to fill all this? Click on it, and it filled it. Now notice it didn't catch the letters in here, and that's simply because this Smart Fill angle is set too low. If I crank it up to almost 60, it almost catches it. If I crank it up to 90, still won't quite catch it. So there's an angle threshold you got to play with in order to see which fill is faster. So let's take a look at this little hole line. I have the Smart Fill down to 4. It only wants to fill a little bit of area at a time, right? If I crank the infill angle up to, say, almost 40, it fills a larger portion at a time. So it depends on how fast or how detailed you want to get about printing these supports. Now let's take a look at what this looks like when we go to slice it. So remember, we've painted just supports on the bottom. And voila, we have just supports on the bottom. But say for some reason, I kind of wanted to support this one up here. Well, it's real easy. You go back, you grab supports, you highlight that overhang angle again, and you can paint on a support there. And go ahead and slice it again, and there's your supports. But now you're thinking, well, I don't want these supports to ruin the surface of my benchy. How do I fix that? Well, there's another support type called support tree. Same thing, auto and manual, depends on if you've painted supports on or not. And what these do is it tries to be a little more organic and tries to avoid touching the part if possible. So you can see it kind of wraps itself around there, and it's just in an awkward position. It's going to try and position it here and try to get it on the outside of the benchy, so maybe it's not going to leave as much of a scar. You can try putting support on build plate only to see if it gets around that. The only caveat is it may not support it at all if it can't get to it. So it tried. It's not the best, but it did try. But I will say it's probably a little easier to remove. Now, would it be a good for this kind of surface down here? Probably not. All these little tiny individual branches aren't going to be very strong, and as it's building up, you can see that there's a lot of potential for it to knock over. So the rule of thumb with supports, at least in my opinion, is if it's going to be a large flat surface, just go ahead and use normal supports. Even if that means having a few that you have to pluck off a surface up here. It's just going to give you a better result, it's going to be stronger, and you're probably going to succeed with your prints. If you have a very organic model that you need to support with, tree supports are better. So if you have fine details like hands or ears or something, it's probably going to be a little better. But experiment with them. Try it out. See what works best for you. What's easier for you to remove, and what success settings you have. Alright, this video is getting a little long, but one last thing I wanted to leave you with is how to place an object on a flat surface and how to cut an object if it's too big. So next to the Move, Rotate, and Scale button is Play or Lay on Face. So if you click this, it'll try and analyze the model for good faces in order to lay the part on. Now, us as humans know that the flatter the better, and you can just click that and it will lay it on the face. You can try and lay it on one of these other random faces, but it's probably not going to print that well. You can confirm that by slicing the plate and seeing, it's going to look quite weird. You can see it's actually taking a longer time as it tries to figure out what to do. Now, with supports, technically this may print and may succeed, but it's going to look pretty rough when you take all those supports off. So logically, the best way is to print it on the most flattest surface and the most upright surface. Now there's also an auto arrange on face button. So if I had a part that came in like this, I can click on this auto orient button. It'll try to find the most optimal orientation to give it the best bed contact and the least amount of overhangs. So when in doubt, hit the auto orient button. It gets it right about 80% of the time. Now what if your benchy is absolutely massive? It's such a big benchy. It can't fit on the plate. You can see it kind of, darkened this area where it says it can't fit. I don't know what you're trying to do. It gives you a warning down here. Well, you can actually cut it up into different objects. Right next to that lay on face button is a cut tool. Click that, and it'll immediately start about halfway up the object. If you do nothing else but click Perform Cut, it will actually split it in two. And then you can move each object individually however you want. Now there's also the option of clicking on that cut tool, and you can actually rotate that plane cut however you want it. You want to cut it in half vertically at a 45-degree angle? It's your option. You can also select that maybe you don't want the bottom piece. Unselect this object B, and the bottom piece goes away. Similar thing will happen if you deselect object A as well. Now you can actually specify a height right here, or you can grab the little yellow icon in the middle and slide it up and down to where you think is best. If you happen to know how much you want to cut off, you can actually go ahead and put that in here, hit enter, and it moves it to the exact layer height. So now you've seen how to actually rotate, how to lay on face, how to cut, how to arrange objects, how to clone objects, and how to work with multiple build plates. In the next video, we'll go a little bit more in depth on changing some strength settings, changing some quality settings to 1, increase your speed, and 2, increase the quality of your prints. So I hope this has been helpful on video number 2 in this series. Until next time, catch you later.